Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you for your availability today. I know that we're getting close to the holidays and we're trying to squeeze in a number of things, hopefully to better educate all of us about the task ahead and to work on simultaneously a number of things that we have ongoing. As you know, we are in the process, and I think we have it now clearly notified the entire public in reference to the executive director's position. And we will hopefully move aggressively to fill that very quickly because it is really important for us to do so. So keep that point in mind. A number of you have asked about it, and I think, Britt, if there's anything else you want to say about it in terms of the deadline and time frame for us here?
Hey, you're muted, Britt.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's posted and up, and I know that there are 3 or 4 applicants. A week ago, I heard that. I don't know if any more have come in or not.
Okay. All right. Well, as I said before, we're going to try to move aggressively because it is really crucial for us to fill the position as quickly as possible. Today, this is a continuation of our ongoing educational process. The retreat formulated in a different format today for us, but one of the things that I'd ask Rachel to do was to try to give us a little bit more background in terms of specific things that we have to do and having a better understanding of the financial implications to much of what we were going to be doing over the next few years, because once you have that picture, you can associate it with the actions taken both at the state, the General Assembly, and most important at the local level. It will better, I think, provide you with a background and understanding for the decisions that we make about the particular areas that we want to make sure that are properly funded and meeting the objectives that the blueprint has outlined for us. This is crucial. It is challenging at times, and I've always said to people, sometimes you're looking at numbers and dates and times and trying to relate it all. This is not to give you an advanced degree today on the finances, some of the things that we're going to talk about, but it's also to whet your appetite to make certain that you follow up, to go back, ask the appropriate questions where need be, and to fill in that knowledge gap that you may have. So, Ray, why don't we go with things, especially about the organizational effort for today, and questions and answers and how we would try to address it as well.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a PowerPoint presentation that is a little over 50 slides. It's a lot, though not quite as many as last meeting. But even still, it actually is, I would say, like there's the 50,000 foot view, and then there's like the 10,000 foot view, and then there's like street level. And I would call this like right around 10,000 foot is what I aimed for. So there's still a significant amount of detail underneath what I'm going to talk about. And so, as the chair said, hopefully this kind of whets your appetite. And we, in future meetings, you can go deeper into the various topics and policy areas. So the way it's organized is to first talk about the 5 policy areas of the blueprint for Maryland's future, and then to discuss the new funding and funding formulas. And what I thought I would do is go through the first 4 policy areas and then, pause for questions and discussion. And then the 5th policy area, which is essentially the AIB and accountability, and have questions and discussion, and then go through the funding section, and then finally have questions and whatever other discussion you'd like to have. But feel free to, if there's something you need to clarify along the way, you can ask questions anytime. And Mindy is going to keep track of questions for the chair today. So if you would try to use your little hand, that would be very helpful. It's hard to see sometimes. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And you should have all these materials, and also they're posted on the website for the public. And so the first slide, so I'm kind of going to try to look at the camera, but I have to look at my second screen at the same time here. So the overview of the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, as I discussed, policies, the timelines, and then the funding and the funding formulas. So I thought I'd just start out with a quick sort of recap of how we got where we are. So at the last meeting, Dr. Kerwin discussed the Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education and its work, and we had some very good briefing information from National Center for Education and the Economy. So chapter 771 of 2019 picks up about 2/3 of the way through the commission's work. And as Dr. Kerwin said, the commission, it took more time than originally intended to finish the commission's work. And so Senate Bill 1030 of 2019, which was enacted into law as Chapter 771, was sort of what we call the bridge to Kerwin legislation that laid out the very high level framework for the Blueprint for Maryland's Future in terms of the policies, and also provided some new funding so that the school systems could begin to implement pieces of the new policies. And that included, there was funding provided for an initial 3% teacher salary increase. There was this is all state funding that was provided, funding for additional special education, enhanced special education funding. There was funding for transitional supplemental instruction, or we refer to that as TSI, and generally you can think of it as tutoring, although it can be more than that, and some other things. And so that was the 2019 legislation. And then in 2020, House Bill 1300 of 2020 is the bulk of the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. So that is the legislation that contains both the more detailed policy pieces of the blueprint, as well as the funding and funding formula provisions. That bill was passed in March of 2020, just before we all went into pandemic lockdown, and the governor did veto that in May, citing the cost of implementing the blueprint, and at the time what was anticipated to be negative fallout from the pandemic on the state's finances. And then this past February, the General Assembly overrode the veto of that bill, and so it took effect 30 days later. So the 2020 legislation took effect in March of 2021. And then during this past legislative session, after the House Bill 1300 was overridden, the General Assembly passed additional legislation to make revisions to the blueprint that were needed to adjust timelines and deadlines due to the delay effective date, and also to address the impacts of the pandemic on our schools, including providing additional funding for technology. We discovered that every student needs a needs a device, as well as impacts on the school funding formulas related to enrollment counts, which decreased significantly in the fall of 2020 due to the pandemic, and also to address learning loss and behavioral mental health issues as a result of students and staff dealing with the pandemic. And those latter pieces were addressed with federal COVID-19 relief funds that went to the state. So what I'm going to discuss is the blueprint sort of in its final form as of now. So the combination of all of the pieces of legislation and where the law is at this point. So we've talked about the 5 major policy areas and the funding and some of the policies are phased in over about 12 years now, starting in fiscal 23, which is the upcoming fiscal year. So we're currently in fiscal 22. And originally the intent was that the funding would begin in fiscal 22, but due to the timing of the veto and the veto override, the additional funding was not mandated for fiscal 22, although there was some additional funding provided by the governor and the General Assembly. And then we mentioned at the last meeting that the commission developed an implementation plan for the 5 policy areas that attempts to sorry, just wanted to make sure I can see everybody here, to sort of deal with how different pieces of policies within policies and between policy areas kind of need to work together and be phased in a thoughtful way. As I go through this, I'm going to sort of toggle back and forth between the PowerPoint and the implementation plan. And then in terms of the funding, there's new state and local funding that totals by fiscal 2030, $3.5 billion increase in funding under the blueprint. So the first policy area is early childhood, and this encompasses everything essentially before kindergarten. And the biggest recommendation or policy change is to expand full day pre-kindergarten to all low-income 3 and 4-year-olds, as well as a sliding scale for other 4-year-olds. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So what the commission recommended, what the General Assembly has enacted into law is essentially a mixed delivery system of public and private providers that would serve 4-year-olds and low-income 3-year-olds in a high quality settings. And it's voluntary. So it's up to the families whether to enroll their children in this pre-kindergarten, full day pre-kindergarten for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. Currently, meaning pre-blueprint, this gets complicated. Pre-blueprint, the school systems are required to provide a half day, which is 2.5 hours of pre-K for low-income 4-year-olds. And in the pre-blueprint law, low income is defined as 185% of the federal poverty level, which is the eligibility for free and reduced price meals. Under the blueprint, low income is expanded to up to 300% of the federal poverty level, which is about $75,000 for a family of four, a little more than that now. And then for 4-year-olds that are have an income, whose families have an income of between 300 and 600% of the poverty level, would be a sliding scale where those children's families would pay a portion of the cost, and the state and local governments would pick up the rest of the cost. And then above 600%, the families would pick up the full cost. The idea is to create a publicly funded system that has children from all socioeconomic backgrounds and in the same classrooms. So that is mainly the reason for the sliding scale and the family share, as well as the cost, obviously. I said a mixed delivery system, so public providers, meaning the public schools, and then private providers, childcare providers, who are currently, we know in the pandemic, there have been a lot of challenges with childcare providers being able to stay in business, quite frankly. And so this is something that I think there will probably need to be some tweaking of at least the timeline for the implementation of the full day pre-K, and to think about how to best incorporate the providers as much as possible. There are minimum requirements in the law. So at least 30% of the pre-K slots are required to be provided by private providers beginning in fiscal 25, I believe. That is potentially a challenge to achieve that. And this last item here, the State Department of Education actually has a report due to the AIB on January 1st, essentially on what their plans are for implementing full day pre-K, and in this case, I think where they might be recommending changes. And then I'll just move on. The other high level provisions within policy area 1, there is the State Department of Education is required to develop a new kindergarten readiness assessment that would be given to every incoming kindergartner beginning in the 22-23 school year, so next fall. And that we do have a KRA now, and there have been some concerns with it. And so that is why the law requires a new KRA to be developed and administered. In terms of being able to have enough slots, that's really the challenge with moving to full day pre-K for 4 and some 3-year-olds. The challenge is having enough qualified staff to provide the educational delivery for kids. And so there's a significant amount of funding dedicated to increasing the capacity and the number of high quality providers and staff for early childhood. You can see it's about 20 million per year at full implementation. And that essentially continues until there's enough slots to serve all of the 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds whose families would like them to enroll. And then there are 2 types of centers that we have in the state now. One are family support centers, which are essentially for families 0 to 3. And then Judy Hoyer centers, what we call Judy centers. that are for the pre-K 4 and 5-year-old families going into elementary school that provide access to coordinated services, community services, social services to families with young children. They're primarily located in Title I, in neighborhoods where there are Title I schools or other areas of concentrated poverty. And the law now greatly expands the number of those centers. 30 new family support centers and 135 new Judy centers would be established in the next 10 years. And then finally, the Maryland Infants and Toddlers Program, which is essentially for young children who are identified as having special needs. There is a formula that has not been fully funded in the past, and the law now requires that the formula be fully funded. So that is the high level on early childhood. And I'm just going to toggle, if you can see that, to the implementation plan. And so this is what the commission developed and provided at its last meeting, and then in the final report. It's behind the times, so to speak, because it was done in 2020, and so it actually assumed that fiscal 21 was the first year of implementation and funding, and now essentially year 3 on this chart is year 1, which is in part why the implementation takes longer beyond fiscal 30, which this plan went out to fiscal 30. But you can see that, so the way it's organized is each recommendation of the commission. So the 1 stands for the policy area, and then A, recommendation B, recommendation C. So 1A here is the full day pre-K expansion. And so you can see that what the commission laid out is an expansion of slots for the low-income 4-year-olds in the 1st through year 6, so that by fiscal 26, all 4-year-olds who wish to be served, low-income 4-year-olds whose family want to enroll them in full-day pre-K, there would be a slot for them. And then the sliding scale under what the commission was proposing would then start in fiscal 27. And the 3 low-income 3-year-olds would essentially kind of be sprinkled along the way. The timeline that the commission had envisioned and the final timeline in the law are not exactly the same. So in the law, the sliding scale is authorized to begin in fiscal 25 as opposed to fiscal 27. And then 1B are all the programs to increase accreditation and credentialing and high quality that essentially phase up throughout the time. This is the KRA, which originally was intended to be administered in fiscal 21, and then the new Judy centers and new family support centers, which are now called Patty centers, actually, after Dr. Kerwin's wife. So that's policy area 1. Everyone good for me to keep going? Okay. Policy area 2 is high quality and diverse teachers and leaders. So this covers teacher preparation programs and teaching licensure or certification, as we call it in Maryland. It also deals with teacher compensation and working conditions in schools. So on the teacher compensation piece, The commission recommended and the blueprint law requires the school systems to provide a 10% salary increase above what was previously negotiated or regularly negotiated. So above sort of the steps, the regular steps and lane type of raises, a 10% salary increase to close the gap between the average salary of teachers in Maryland and the average salary of teachers in our peer states. And those NCEE mentioned them at the last meeting were Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New Jersey. So this 10% salary increase began in fiscal 20 with the first 3%. And then due to the delays in the timing of the law, the next amount of funding that will be provided for the increase is in fiscal 23. And there will also be funding in fiscal 24. So that the full 10% increase can be provided by the deadline, which is fiscal 24. And just as a reminder, we're currently in fiscal 22. So the budget that the General Assembly considers at this session will be for fiscal 23. Fiscal 23 will begin in July 1. And then the 10% has to be provided by fiscal 24. And then there's also a requirement to increase the starting salary of all teachers to $60,000 all over the state by fiscal 27. And then in addition to these salary increases, there are other salary increases that are built into the new career ladder, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And then another big piece of what the commission recommended and what the law requires is for teachers to have more time during the school day when they are not literally in front of the classroom instructing students. So more collaborative time with peers, to work individually or in small groups with students, to develop interventions for students who are falling behind. And so right now, about 80% of a teacher's time is spent in front of the classroom. And the goal and what the law requires now is that over time that all teachers would teach 60% of the time, as opposed to 80% of the time. And so that the funding for that is phased in over 8 years, fiscal 26 through fiscal 33. And it is later part of the sequencing issue. It is later because in part so that some of the changes in the teacher preparation programs and the requirements for teacher licensure would be implemented before we as a state and the school system start hiring lots of new teachers, because essentially what this means, in order to accomplish this, there will need to be more teachers in every school in order to allow that all of them to be in front of the classroom less often. So it will not, a lot of the time, in especially American education, we talk about small class sizes. We're not talking about smaller class sizes. We're talking about smaller pupil to teacher ratios overall. So
Rachel,
that,
real quick, I think Fagan Harris has his hand up.
okay.
Thank you. Just a quick question. The increases in teacher compensation, that comes from the AIB funding over the life of the AIB, or is that just required and then the district's budget for that?
So there is funding provided through the blueprint formulas for the 10% out for the state's share of the 10% salary increase. I'll get into this a little more later, but there's a state and a local share of most education funding. And so what the formulas do is they determine what the total is, and then they determine how much of it the state will pay and how much each county, which includes Baltimore City, has to pay. So the funding for that and for the 60,000 minimum salary is provided in the funding formulas.
Thank you.
Sure.
And then we have Jennifer Lynch.
I am just wondering, when it talks about improving the working conditions of schools and having teachers in front of students a little bit less often, is there a capital implication of that, of increased collaborative workspaces for teachers or increased classroom spaces if you have additional teaching spaces? You know, was there any capital consideration of what an increased workforce would look like in terms of space in the building?
Unmute. Okay. Excellent question and very timely. There is a work group that has been meeting throughout this interim. And one of the issues they're looking at is how much space is provided in schools, should be provided and should be paid for by the state. And one of the things that the group is having their final meeting tomorrow, actually, and one of the recommendations they will be considering is asking the Interagency Commission on School Construction to look at the space implications of various things in the blueprint, including the additional teacher planning space and collaborative space, as well as breakout space for the one-on-one and small group instruction. Obviously, we talked about pre-K just a minute ago. There are clearly potential capital implications for additional public pre-K where the school systems provide the pre-K classrooms. And so, and some of that was anticipated as part of the commission's work, particularly on pre-K. Others of it, it's sort of, as this work group has been doing its work, it's kind of risen in all of our minds that there are space implications. Maybe not ultimately, then it becomes a question of how much space, you know, schools have available and how they can meet the space needs.
And Mr. Minko?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to question, you know, a lot of these human capital assumptions were made prior to the pandemic. And, you know, I think just with teacher shortages and potential people leaving the profession, that some of these assumptions may be changing. So wanted to get a sense of how we can or should be addressing that to, you know, make sure that some of these assumptions are still valid and plausible moving forward.
So I've been thinking about that also, and the Department of Legislative Services has been continued working with the consultant, APA Consulting, that worked with the commission that conducted the adequacy study for the state actually prior to the commission's creation, and then worked with the commission and with DLS on the costing out and all of the estimates and projections. And so I've actually been talking with APA about specifically needing to update projections on pre-K capacity, particularly with providers with the impact of the pandemic, and also the teacher projections in terms of the number of, there's a lot of assumptions about the number of teachers who will pursue national board certification and receive national board certification that have a lot of fiscal implications, as well as, I think to your point, the ability to actually hire the teachers the additional teachers that the blueprint is calling for. The good news is that piece is backloaded. So with a little luck, by the time we get to that piece, there will be more teachers. Is that everyone for the moment? Okay. So teacher preparation. There are many provisions in the law related to teacher preparation. So I've really boiled it down here to the very, the most significant. But essentially, what the commission recommended and what the law requires is that teacher preparation programs incorporate into their curriculum and instruction some things that aren't always being taught, and that teachers are learning when it's sort of on the job training instead of being prepared. And so this includes basic research skills and the ability to look at data and analyze data like student assessment scores, differentiation of instruction, cultural competency, effective classroom management, and restorative practices. And that relates mostly to school discipline issues. And then beginning July 1, 2025, there are two major changes. The first is that in order to graduate from a Maryland teacher preparation program, teachers would need to, candidates, I should say, would need to pass a portfolio-based assessment of teaching ability. And TPA is one of those. There are a few. And then also beginning July 1, 2025, there would be a requirement that undergraduate teacher candidates and also alternative teacher candidates, is sort of, it varies depending on the type of provider, but there are a teacher training practicum, which is sort of a fancy word for what we all kind of think of as student teachers, student teaching, but it's really more of a residency approach that under pre-blueprint law, Maryland teacher prep programs are already required to have teachers participate in a residency program that is 100 days, and that is very rare in the United States. So Maryland is ahead of the curve and has been for quite some time. And the residencies are provided in professional development schools, which are specific schools that are selected by the teacher prep programs to for them to place their students there. And there's a faculty member who, is essentially kind of, I don't know if they're assigned to the school specifically, but they're responsible for the students in that school. And so what the commission recommended and what is now required is that instead of 100 days, that would be in a full school year, which is 180 days. And the law specifically says that it doesn't have to be 180 consecutive days. So it's not necessarily an entire school year all at one time. It can be spread out depending on how the teacher prep programs want to organize it. But it's obviously a major change. And the intent is that students spend more time sort of getting on the ground kind of frontline training, real life training. And the intent is that these professional development schools would essentially be organized like the blueprint wants all of the public schools to be organized. So they would sort of be like laboratories essentially for for all of the policies that the blueprint is providing now or requiring.
And I
Dr.
think we have one
Stapleton,
hand
do you
up.
want, should I pause?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I just have kind of two questions sort of about intent and whether something was discussed. One is, so this 180 days, that number doesn't appear in the blueprint, but it does say full school year. So I think some folks are considering, well, full school year, you're talking about the experiences that somebody would get if they were in the school during an entire academic year, like the grading so it's not kind of seat time or days there. So there's a little confusion about kind of what the intent was. Was it to get certain experiences, or was it actual just kind of seat time? And then the second question I had was there any discussion about monetary support for this change? Because students who are going through right now, they're able to do part-time jobs, things like that. Whereas if they are required to do a longer internship, this would prevent them from doing that, which is just another obstacle for students to become teachers.
So I was gonna double check, but I can't do it right now. But I believe the report says 180 days. I think calling it a full school year in the statute, I think might have been a drafting style, because potentially the number of days in the school year it does change depending on sometimes the state board approves waivers, and it only had to be 170 this year, that kind of thing. So I think that's why the term full school year was used in the bill, or in the law. But the intent is, and again, not all in one fell swoop, doesn't have to be that way, to get the as you say, the full school year experience from the beginning of the school year through to the end of the school year, and all of those experiences. But I don't want to call it seat time, but it is intended to be an entire school year of actual days. And then on the funding side, I mentioned that the additional scholarship funding. So there is, I think it increases to $18 million in state scholarship funding for teacher candidates, that is provided as part of the blueprint. So I don't know if that is sufficient to address, the concerns you're raising.
Yeah, I'd like at a future point, I'd like to kind of map that back to if we are sort of funding this internship or this practicum year, how much would that cost be? Thanks, Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
One more, Dr. Doss.
Thank you. I'm all for growing your own programs in Maryland, but with the earlier discussion of needing more teachers, how or does the blueprint address anything about out-of-state recruitment and how that plays into this?
Not specifically. I think I would say it was greatly discussed by the commission, the fact that Maryland we're a net importer of teachers, and that we need to, that ideally we would be graduating more students in state and preparing them in the ways that, the public schools in Maryland are based on expectations of the public schools in Maryland. But at the end of the day, obviously the state can only affect change in our institutions. There is also a requirement for professional development training and additional training for existing teachers. And so I think that is sort of part of an answer for you. But I do also think that ultimately, I think there, ideally there would be some work with particularly neighboring states or states where we tend to attract teachers from, and sort of working with them and their teacher prep institutions to address some of the provisions that that the blueprint is requiring.
I think there's a concern from my side, and I'm not sure how it is addressed, that we have the opposite effect, is that the taxpayers of Maryland, with the additional training and preparation that we'll provide, will become a laboratory or a feeding ground for other states to take teachers that we've already trained. Now, I assume, and maybe Britt can answer this, that the assumption that when we include the increased pay, the increased professionalism, those things working in conjunction with that would be an incentive for the teachers to stay. But what is it directly that would preclude us training teachers and they leave? That we've trained them from Pennsylvania, New York, or some from Massachusetts. This is why I think you have to look at all of those things in tandem, that the pay, the other incentives that you provide will be an inducement for those teachers that we have trained to stay. But as opposed to taking people from other states, my concern is they're taking those from us because we have now better trained them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a couple of things. One is the career ladder provides for substantial salary, the potential for substantial salary increases. So I do think the pay structure in Maryland is going to be seen as very favorable. Also, this notion that teachers will have much more time to act as professionals and have cooperation and planning and time to develop curriculum and other things will create a much better working environment than exists in most states. So I do think the total package will be a huge inducement for keeping teachers in states. In state. Is there some? I can't remember because it came up, Rachel, at various points. Is there any loan forgiveness for teachers if they stay a certain number of years in the profession?
Yes, there is an existing loan assistance repayment program in the state for teachers, and it was expanded by the blueprint. And it gives a priority for teachers that teach in schools with concentration of poverty schools with 55% or more free and reduced price meal students.
Are you saying that there is a general loan agreement, payback agreement, or is just for particular areas of the state in which you're working in efforts to, in response to Britt's question?
There is an existing loan assistance repayment program in the state, and it's the Nancy Grasmick Loan Assistance Repayment Program. And as part of the recommendations of the commission, they recommended expanding it and giving a priority to teachers who, for example, teach in high concentration poverty schools. So basically for new teachers who go to teach in a low performing or high concentration of poverty school, they would have a priority to receive loan assistance repayment funds from the state.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to move on to teacher licensure. So actually, let me just say, so July 1, 2025, you can see is a date that has a couple of different provisions tied to it. And the intent there was to provide enough time for the teacher preparation programs to make the adjustments to their curriculums and their practices so that students who graduated from their programs beginning July 1, 2025 would be able to meet the new requirement that the state would be requiring, which is this passing on the portfolio-based assessment. Passing that would become a requirement of initial licensure. So those dates are sort of tied together, and potentially with the delay in the implementation, there's not enough time at this point before that would go into effect. And then the other new requirement would be to pass a mastery of reading instruction and also content in the area that the teacher will be teaching. For the grade level they'll be teaching. So those are some additional requirements for receiving initial licensure that there are some teacher prep programs that already do require an assessment of teaching ability, but not all of them do in Maryland. And then the mastery of reading instruction would be a new requirement, as well as the content for the grade that the teacher would be teaching. And then as part of the last bullet there, so the intent and the requirement is that MSDE would develop these subject-specific grade level exams in advance so that students would have the ability to, essentially review them and, prep for them so that they have the ability to pass them. And throughout the blueprint, there are requirements that different state entities and agencies consult with or collaborate with the AIB as they adopt regulations or implement policies. And for teacher licensure, that would involve the State Board of Education and this entity called the Professional Standards and Teacher Education Board, or PSTEB. And under the blueprint, both the State Board and PSTEB have to approve of changes to teacher licensure and teacher preparation regulations. I won't get into what it used to be, but as of the effective date of the blueprint, they both have to agree. And in this case, in consultation with the AIB. Slide 9, this goes to the professional development and in-service training that the blueprint calls for. And so there would be a new induction program for new teachers that would ideally, ultimately, will use teachers from the career ladder to be mentors to new teachers. And then there would also be a new system of professional development that would be tied to the career ladder that would help train teachers on, existing teachers, on how to use the additional collaborative time that will be provided, and other training on the science of learning and effective classroom management. But some of the things that I talked about, the teacher preparation programs would be required to provide to new teachers, would also be part of the in-service training for existing teachers. And then we have the career ladder. So the career ladder is in the blueprint law, there is a framework or minimum requirements for a career ladder that each school board would adopt for its school system. And the career ladder has to meet the minimum requirements of the law. And that is in the judgment of the AIB. The career ladder is focused on providing pathways for teachers to stay in the classroom and have a professional growth within the classroom without needing to move to the administration in order to receive significant salary increases. That's a big piece of it. And also to have greater responsibilities within the classroom and the school. Is that too small? I don't know if I can make, oh, I think I can. So this is a graphic that kind of lays out the levels of the career ladder that are laid out in the statute now. So the first level is, a licensed teacher with the new licensure requirements that I just talked about. And then in order to proceed up the ladder, teachers would need to pursue national board certification in a subject area that they ideally are currently teaching in or want to teach in. And once they achieve national board certification, which would be voluntary in the beginning, then once they achieve national board certification, they receive a significant salary increase. And I have the salary information later in the funding section, but for achieving national board certification is a $10,000 salary increase, and if to the base. And then for teachers that teach in low performing schools, it's an additional $7,000. And then once teachers achieve national board certification, then they can move up the teacher leadership track, which is here on the left. And it's level 4, but there are then these 3 tiers of level 4: lead teacher, distinguished teacher, and professor distinguished teacher, which there are very, very few of those. And then there's also this administrator track for principals and distinguished principals who long-term would also need to be national board certified. So it all kind of hinges on national board certification. And there is also in the blueprint law a national board support program for that the state MSDE would administer or manage, I should say, and each school system would have a national board coordinator to help teachers with the process and sort of have affinity groups for, peer networking and working together as they go through the national board certification process. There are several components to the national board certification process. It can be all completed in 1 year, but that is very challenging to get it all done in 1 year. But whenever, the teachers can move at their own pace. And so as quickly as they want to and are able to achieve national board certification, they would then be able to receive the salary increase. And then along with the salary increase is additional responsibilities to provide, fill leadership roles in the school building, to be a mentor to other teachers, to lead the professional learning community in a school within a grade level or a subject area in a school or, across schools. So in addition to just the achieving national board certification, there would also be additional roles and responsibilities. There's a lot more on the career ladder in the statute. And we could spend a lot of time just on the career ladder. The one other thing I wanted to say is that the state and the school systems pay the fees. So the teachers do not, there's no out-of-pocket cost for the teachers to pursue national board certification. I think.
Rachel,
Yeah.
Rachel,
Yeah.
I just want to say, for the benefit of the other board members, that the commission became aware of some rather impressive research showing the effect of board certification on teacher quality. That's why we focused on this requirement for board certification. And there are 2 other states, I believe, that are well along the path to requiring that of teachers, the state of Washington and the state of North Carolina.
Yes. Correct.
And Rachel, Laura Stapleton has a question.
Yes.
Right. Just a quick question, and Britt, you might also want to chime in here. I was just curious. Love the idea of having incentives for folks to teach in low performing schools. So that how did the number 7,000 come out? And do we have evidence that that might lead to folks moving schools? I'm just wondering if that number is too low. I mean, not that I have the magic wand and I can change it, but just in terms of evaluating policy.
We did, so I will have to look into that a little more to refresh my memory. We did look at the, Dr. Kerwin mentioned Washington and North Carolina. And there's a third state. And we were looking at the amounts of their incentives and whether it had really driven change, and it hadn't. And so, you know, I think for just national board certification, not for attracting teachers to low performing schools, but the needing to get into the double digits, or I should say 5, you know, so above 10,000 or above seem to be, and I don't know that there's anything magic about it, but that in the data that we were looking at seemed to be a good place to start, at least. For the low performing schools, you know, again, I can go back and check notes and records and things. I don't really recall that was driven by anything specific. It was sort of what's enough to get someone's attention, but less than $10,000 to not have it. And there are I've heard some people who think it's way too much. So it's interesting, you know, the reaction. I will say, one thing is that, well, 2 things about low performing schools. One is that the definition of low performing schools in the statute is left to the county boards to determine. Long story short, the MSCE and Superintendent Chaudhary has been working with the local superintendents who wanted a more consistent definition to use. And so they have been working on agreeing on a minimum definition, at least, of what low performing will be for the $7,000 increase. And so hopefully that will provide some consistency. The statute also specifically says that once you get the 7,000, you know, if you are teaching in a low performing school and that school becomes over time not low performing, you get to keep the incentive. And I mean, that was done on purpose because it's not much incentive if you take it away when the school improves. But I have also heard some concerns about that and whether a teacher at some point should be required to sort of move to another low performing school or something like that. Okay, so I will move on. I think there's not too much more in this section. In terms of other training provisions in the blueprint, there is a requirement that all certificated school personnel, so that includes teachers, but also instructional assistants and teachers' aides and others in the schools, that they receive training on recognizing student behavioral health issues, student trauma issues, and how to support students and their needs in the schools. And then there's also a requirement that MSDE provide leadership training on the blueprint for the state and local superintendents and instructional staff, sort of central office instructional staff, and then also for the boards of education members and school principals. And there's a lot more, but we'll stop there on policy area 2. And I'll go ahead and move on to policy area 3, which is broadly described as college and career readiness, but that it encompasses so much in terms of the curriculum and the standards and supports and instructional materials, and the back mapping of what we want students to need to be able to know and do to be considered college and career ready, and then back mapping that all the way to pre-kindergarten so that we have our instructional, the curriculum and then the instructional sort of sequencing so that students have the ability to be college and career ready by the end of 10th grade. That is sort of, Mark Tucker at the last meeting talked about this fairly extensively, so I won't spend too much time on it, but having students be college and career ready by the end of 10th grade instead of the end of high school, which is essentially what our goal is now, if that, I mean, it's a goal, but it's not necessarily a stated goal, is sort of the central piece of the blueprint, and working back from that for students to be able to be college and career ready by the end of 10th grade. What does that mean for everything along the way? And for students who are falling behind along the way, needing to identify that and get them the additional services and supports that they need to get back on track as quickly as possible so that they can achieve this college and career readiness by the end of 10th grade. And for students who are not college and career ready by the end of 10th grade, that there would be something different for those students, not just, take the course over again, because that if it didn't work the first time, it's highly unlikely to work the second or third time. So something different for students who aren't college and career ready by the end of 10th grade, so that in the 11th and 12th grade, they could actually become college and career ready and graduate with that college and career ready credential. And so part of this is MSDE developing with highly effective teachers and ultimately teachers on the career ladder, standards and instructional materials and lesson plans and all sorts of additional materials that would be posted on the website that all teachers could access and see what what high quality instructional materials look like for at each grade and subject in order to get to college and career ready by 10th grade. So that's a lot.
Rachel,
yes.
Rachel, are you going to talk about the commission's recommendations or the blueprints language on the definition of college and career ready?
Yes, and
Okay.
I can actually.
I didn't want to jump ahead. I mean, if it's coming up, that's fine, because I think it's important for people to understand.
Absolutely. Yes. So yeah, I don't mind jumping ahead. So so college and career ready, the commission's definition ultimately of college and career ready is what students need to be able to know and do to be successful in entry level credit bearing courses at community colleges or other open enrollment institutions in the state. So the commission recommended, and it is now in the law, that there would be a study of what that standard should be in reading, writing, math, and science based on Maryland's community colleges. Under the law right now, that study would begin July 1 of 2022 and would need to be completed by roughly a year later, September of 2023, which would then sort of set off MSDE and the state board determining whether new college and career ready standards are necessary, what they should be, and then how our existing assessments, which we've been through a couple rounds of assessments now while the commission has been meeting. And so we've moved from PARC to what is now called the Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program, or MCAP. So we have MCAP now, and the question would be, are the existing MCAPs sufficient to measure college and career readiness, or would there need to be changes to the assessments? And so all of those things would need to happen to then create, to really have a documented college and career ready standard. Under PARC and the equivalency in MCAP, we do have some rough approximations of what college and career ready is based on the English 10 assessment and the algebra assessment, but it's not mapped to our community colleges. So that is what the commission talked about quite a bit and planned for. But until those things happen, we do have what we use as college and career ready for 10th grade under our current system. And that would continue to be used until this new standard was identified and then implemented. So let me go here. I talked a little bit about students needing to stay on track. There is this program called Transitional Supplemental Instruction. It's a mouthful. The commission recommended this. It's in the law. And it's essentially one of the key benchmarks for students being on track for college and career readiness and is reading proficiently by grade 3. And so this TSI, as we call it, program provides intervention services, mostly tutoring, but it could be one-on-one, it could be small group tutoring for students who need it. The funding is based on third graders who have not achieved proficiency, but the services can be provided to other students as well. And actually, as part of the state's response to the learning losses in the pandemic, additional funds have been provided for the TSI program for tutoring, supplemental tutoring, for any student who needs it, who has fallen behind, which is pretty much most of them, in the pandemic. The TSI funding phases up, it ramps up, it stays at this high level for a couple of years, and then it phases out. And the timing of the phase out is tied to the timing of when more teachers will be coming into school buildings, as teachers have more collaborative time and time to work with students one-on-one and in small groups themselves, rather than through hiring other tutors. So essentially, these separate tutors would ultimately be replaced by the additional teachers that are going to be in the schools and working with students. Oops. And then the law also, the blueprint requires school systems to implement a 9th grade student tracker system. And this is specifically to track whether students are on pace to graduate on time. And so the school systems are actually needing to put in place this system this current school year so that they can begin reporting on the data and the tracking next year. And then, so we've talked about college and career ready by 10th grade, what we do for students who aren't college and career ready in 10th grade, in 11th and 12th grade, what we do in 11th and 12th grade. And then we have what we call post-college and career ready pathways. So these are pathways for the students who are college and career ready at the end of 10th grade and potentially earlier. And the goal here is to provide students rigorous pathways, both for early college to earn early college credits, even, you know, an associate's degree potentially while they're still in high school, and also more rigorous career and technical education programming that really prepares them for, you know, a job with a decent paying wage at graduation, with a credential that is actually recognized by the industry that they would work in. And this also includes apprenticeships. There's a big discussion within the commission about increasing access to CTE and apprenticeships for all students, so that it's not, we kind of have sort of two types of CTE programs in Maryland. We have really, really good programs that are only for the cream of the crop, the best students. And then we have a lot of other more vocational type preparation programs that are not of the highest quality. And so the goal is to provide high quality across the board in all of the various CTE programs that are needed, and that the workforce, getting the workforce and employers more involved, so that CTE programs are preparing students for what they really need to know, and in the fields where there is demand. And so all of this led to the commission recommending, and the blueprint did establish a new CTE committee that would oversee the CTE system in K-12. And instead of having that be in the State Department of Education, the commission proposed that it be located in the Governor's Workforce Development Board, which is in the Maryland Department of Labor. And specifically that was done so that the private sector and employer, public and private employers, have a much stronger voice in designing and holding accountable CTE programs. And so that CTE committee is has not been appointed yet, so that is a next step. And then the CTE committee has quite a bit of work to do in terms of developing more rigorous CTE programs and pathways for students. And there is a goal in the statute. It actually predated the blueprint, but it became incorporated into the blueprint. So the goal is that by 2030, that 45% of high school graduates would leave high school with this industry credential or have completed the high school level of an apprenticeship by 2030.
Rachel, could you remind me, and I hope, I guess others as well, who appoints the CTE board?
So the CTE committee is, it's a combination of, there are certain assigned or specified members, like the state superintendent, the secretary of labor, et cetera. And then there are, I think there are 6 members that are actually jointly appointed by the governor, the speaker, and the president.
Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Chair, it looks like we do have a couple hands up, Jennifer Lynch, and then Joseph Manko, and then Mara Doss.
Okay, go ahead, get them there.
So I have a couple questions around the CTE. I think the first question I have is just to learn a little bit more about why the 45% threshold was considered. Did that have something to do with how many students are entering the workforce directly after high school? And then my second question is around the idea of an industry credential. How is that defined, or was that defined?
So on the 45%, again, some work that predates the blueprint. In the sort of mid 14, 15, probably a little earlier than that, actually. There's been a push to graduate more students from college with associate's and bachelor's degrees. So essentially to increase the college completion of students so that they're not just getting into college, but they're actually completing, and ideally completing on time, because then that saves the parents and the students money, and it also saves the state money. So the state has a goal that 55% of adults essentially seeking college enrollment would earn either at least an associate's degree, if that's the way we should put it, at least an associate's degree. And this is loosely tied to projections by the Georgetown Center, whose exact name has slipped my mind, but there's a Georgetown Center that looks at workforce needs and educational needs of the jobs, and that roughly 2/3 of jobs in the not so distant future will require at least an associate's degree. And so the state adopted a goal of 55% would earn an associate's degree, and then an additional number that wasn't exactly quantified would receive post-secondary certificates that of value, that actually, that which is similar to this idea of an industry credential. So something of value that that the industry itself values. And so the flip of the 55% goal is 45%. So that is where it came from. It was initially, the goal was sooner, and it was pushed out to fiscal 2030.
Rachel, do we have any baseline data? I'm sorry. Do we have any baseline data on where Maryland is along that 45% goal right now?
Yeah, I think my recollection is it's like 9%. It's
Have it. And how is that because we've defined an industry credential in a particular way? Like,
industry credential is not, so it has to be something that, so it's going to vary depending on the career field. So what an appropriate industry recognized credential is in as an electrician or a plumber is going to be different than what it is for a computer programmer. And so essentially part of what the CTE committee will be doing is setting standards for what industry recognized credential is going to be. And they'll have to figure out how they do that by career field. That's really, the commission spent a lot of time talking about this, but ultimately it left a lot of there's a lot of hard work to do in this area to be done. And they actually brought in, so in addition to the commission members, there was a CTE subcommittee that brought in other private and public sector employers and job training folks, trade union folks, to talk about some of what the real demand, the really great need is for a much more high quality CTE programs in Maryland. Right now, the way that a CTE student is counted is if they complete 4 courses. So those courses don't necessarily lead you to any type of credential or certificate that helps you to get a job in the field that you want to get a job in. And so the idea is to move away from course completion and towards pathways that lead to this industry recognized credential or an apprenticeship, a completed apprenticeship. And there are high school apprenticeships and there are post-secondary apprenticeships. So ideally an apprenticeship, a high school apprenticeship that is aligned with the post-secondary apprenticeship. I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Hey, Rachel. My question was also around baseline data, and I'm just curious about, where we are currently with students meeting the CCR standard by the end of the 10th grade, so that we understand our starting point and where we need to go. Is the first question, and then the second question is around the TSI initiative, and for the individuals that are facilitating the TSI initiative, was there discussion about this running parallel to the practicum requirements for teachers to get certified, so that really those who were tutoring or working in the TSI initiative could that are aspiring to be teachers in the future, that some of those hours could be counted as practicum hours? So 2 very separate questions, but curious.
I see what you're asking on tutoring. Okay, so on college and career readiness, based on using what is considered college and career ready from Park, and the equivalent of that in English 10 and Algebra 1, not 2, 1, roughly based on, and of course we haven't had any assessment results for a couple of years now. We did just get the fall assessment data there've been some announcements of it by the state superintendent, but the data itself has not been released yet. So from the pre-pandemic, the most recent data, about a third of students graduate from high school based on this college and career readiness standard that we would, the approximate of it that we would be using now. And I think a couple of folks have asked for baseline data, and I think that absolutely is sort of the next step as you start thinking about an implementation plan, is sort of what metrics and what baseline data you would want in which metrics to then build off of those for your plan and your intended outcomes. So it's roughly a third of statewide. That varies by school system as well, as you can imagine. So there are some school systems that are quite high, and some that are much lower than the average.
And just to be clear, like the metric we would really be looking at would be the percentage of 10th grade students that, if currently taking the 12th grade assessment, would show as passing or advanced?
So it is based on English 10, which is usually taken in 10th grade by most students. So English 10 and Algebra 1, which is actually often taken in middle school, but some students do take in 9th or 10th grade. So it is based on those two assessments, and with a score of at least proficient. And then on the TSI tutoring and sort of connecting that up with the teacher preparation programs, there was discussion specifically about that it could be a good. Let me back up for a minute. There's a whole issue around how trained tutors need to be effective, and there's volunteers are very helpful, but don't necessarily, the research does not prove that they really have as much of an impact as a trained tutor. And so there was discussion about potentially college students being able to provide some of this tutoring needs for students. But the question, it kind of got bogged down a little bit in the amount of training that they would need to have, and all of that. So, but I think it definitely is something that could be, pursued.
Dr. Doss?
Sure, thank you. Is it the intention of the blueprint that once students are deemed CCR, that the open enrollment institution or community college accept those students into credit-bearing courses without additional stipulation like placement test or college preparation courses?
Yes, that is the ultimate intent. Yes. So the study, part of the study, hopefully what the study would do would provide the evidence to both the public schools and the community colleges and other open enrollment institutions that the standard was being set at a level that would allow students to be successful in the community, in their courses, in their entry-level courses, and therefore they would be willing to enroll them in those courses without any other placement tests like AccuPlacer or things like that.
And then just one more question. What is the impact or the implication for students who never meet the CCR?
So, the discussion in the commission was very strong that we need to build a system where nearly all students are able to achieve college and career readiness. There is always, going to be some percentage of students, particularly who have disabilities, intellectual disabilities, who, are not necessarily going to be able to achieve that goal. But otherwise, if we build the system right, every student can achieve the standard.
Okay, thank you.
I think the last one I
I'm
had to
sorry.
see is
Okay.
Dr. Kerwin.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I wanted to emphasize something that came up in Joe's question. Currently, the college and career ready standard is pass a test based on Algebra 1 and read at the 10th grade level. And Rachel, could you just repeat how many students meet that criteria? What percent meet that at present?
It's 32%.
So think about that. 68% of our high school graduates haven't met that. That's frightening. And when the commission became aware of that fact, we knew there had to be a major overhaul. We can't be successful as a state if that's our future workforce. The other thing I wanted to say about the CTE is that we did a lot of thinking, or got a lot of information, a lot of thinking about the successful systems in Europe. And what we have designed here piggybacks, brings the success of those programs, and they're very successful, the success of those programs into the Maryland context. And I want to emphasize that you don't get into this program unless you're college and career ready at the 10th grade. So, I mean, this is not a sort of a second-rate track for students who can't cut it academically. These are students who've met the college and career ready standard, but see the opportunity that the CTE offers to move into a very high-paying job, higher paying, quite frankly, than a lot of college graduates in some cases that even college graduates step into. So I just wanted to, this wasn't just a group of 25 people thinking about what might work in CTE. This was modeled off of what we learned from the best performing systems.
Here's the challenge that I see, Dr. Kern, is that for those students who have the benefit of getting the full implementation of what we are planning today, I have no doubts that they will be successful. So ideally, if you are a kindergartner starting next year in the Maryland system, by the time you get to the 10th grade, that cohort of students are going to be ready.
Right.
The problem, and I go back to Dr. Doss' question, is that you have those who are now at the 9th, 10th, 11th grade will not get that benefit. And so what happens to those, and that, if you go by your numbers, that's a large number of students that do not get the full benefit of what we are about today. They don't get that. They are somewhere in between, the gap students.
Right.
And that's what I think we need to at least think about to some degree, that ideally we're going to be able to get those kids who come through our system and benefit from an entire array of wonderful teachers, larger numbers of teachers. They're in our kindergarten programs, they're taking the right courses. That group that come through that system at that point I have no doubt for success. The question that I have is that those who are caught between that time cycle and what it is that we can potentially do that may get them at least better ready for their lifestyle, their life chances.
Yeah. Well, that's such a good point, and that was something that troubled the commission for sure. And there's just, I mean, there's no way you can go back if somebody's in the 9th grade and fix the deficiencies they've had up until that time. But there's going to be a lot of resources invested in schools through the community school program, where there's going to be additional tutoring, after school academic programming, summer academic programming. There's going to be this infusion of tutors into the system to sort of help the students that are there right now get better. So, they won't, it's not possible to get them to the standard, to get all students to the standard we hope to see when the program is fully implemented. But we can get all kids to a better place than they otherwise would have been.
Yeah, I think, in fact, the university is better than many university systems around the country in helping their students who need the remedial help and support as they enter college. And they've come up with a concept that I think now places them far and above the national average for those students who otherwise will fail until they enter into college and making them ready. And there's a wonderful study that's out now that talks about the Georgia system that addresses some of those concerns. And we may want to take a look at that at some point.
I'm aware of the Georgia, and you're absolutely right about that. They've done a very good job, Ike, with their college readiness program.
And I would just add that in Maryland, prior to the blueprint, there was another piece of legislation that focused on college readiness and college completion. And part of the college readiness provisions dealt with for high school kids who aren't college and career ready yet, delivering the remedial coursework that they would need, but getting it to them while they're still in high school, rather than when they get to the community college and are paying tuition for non-credit courses. And so we call them, they're called transition courses right now, but essentially the concept is that community colleges actually do an excellent job at developing students who come to them who are not college ready yet, and to try to take the skills that they've developed and the courses they've developed and essentially try to deliver them in 11th and 12th grade so that students get closer at least to college ready before they leave high school. And it's not quite the same as what the blueprint is envisioning with these 11th and 12th grade courses for students who aren't college and career ready by the end of 10th grade, but I think it's similar. And so the transition courses have had some success depending on the school system and the community college and how well their partnerships work together and the delivery of that instruction. But it has had some impact, which I guess is why we're up to almost a third leaving high school, college, and career ready. Much too low.
Which go on?
Okay. Policy area 4 is more resources. Essentially, it's, providing the resources that students need to be successful. So for students that have greater needs, we need to provide more resources for those students. And so that includes English learners who, you know, have the double whammy of not speaking the language and then trying to learn in the language they don't speak. One of the things that the commission recommended was adding funding for family liaisons in public schools. That was something that the commission heard a lot from the public and stakeholders who participated in meetings, was that there needs to be more coordination with the families and by people who speak the language. And so funding for that was added to the English learners. This is starting to get into the funding formula discussion a little bit, but I don't want to go too far down that road. So I'm just going to try to sort of stay up at the 10,000 foot level right now. The commission also recommended significantly more funding for special education, so that the state was fully funding its share of special education costs, essentially. And in the 2019 legislation, a big piece of the additional funding that's been provided since fiscal 20 for school systems is enhanced special education funding. And then there's also the blueprint. I think I know Dr. Kerwin and others have talked about issues with student behavioral issues and behavioral health needs. This was a very big discussion point, not so much in the commission, but in the legislature. And so as part of the blueprint, the General Assembly actually they added to the blueprint a program which is called the Consortium of Coordinated Community Support. So that's an actual program, new program that was created to support the development of community partnerships to meet student behavioral health needs and provide the coordination and also the expertise and assistance to school systems so that they can serve students and meet their needs. So that is a new program that will begin in fiscal 23. And then another, I shouldn't say another, a big point of discussion in the commission was what the additional needs of schools that have a high concentration of students who are living in poverty. And here, that is using the free and reduced price meal criteria. So that is 185% of the federal poverty level, at least currently, that's what it is. And so the commission talked a lot about this and came to the conclusion that the state needed to provide additional funding directly to the schools. So this is the first school level school grant. It doesn't go to this, it's not money that goes to the central office and then they decide how to allocate it out to the schools and what to spend it on. It goes, it's sort of a path, the intent is it's a pass through to the school so that they can use the funds in the way that they determine is the most appropriate. The new grant is for at full implementation, it is for schools that have more than 55% of the students eligible for free and reduced price meals. And when a school becomes eligible for a concentration poverty grant, it receives funding for a full-time community school coordinator. So every school that receives a concentration of poverty grant becomes a community school. And as part of that, they get the funding to hire a full-time coordinator who conducts a needs assessment of the school to determine what the students and families in that school and community need. And then there are per pupil funds that are provided that provide funding to meet those needs. And there's a whole list of wraparound eligible services that the funds can be spent on, depending on the needs of the school and the students in the school. They also receive funding for full-time healthcare coverage. So that is not necessarily a full-time practitioner in each school per se, but coverage by combination of people for the entire school day, including if there are before or after school programs at the school, including that time. Statewide, based on data that the commission looked at in 2019, there would be 557 schools. If you kind of took a snapshot in time in 2019, 557 schools would be eligible around the state for a concentration of poverty grant. And that is in all but one jurisdiction based on that 2019 data, would have at least one school that will receive a concentration of poverty grant. And I have, when we get to the funding, I talk more about specifically how the what the phase-in has been. This is one of the programs that was implemented as part of the Bridge to Kerwin legislation in 2019. So concentration of poverty grants have been funded since fiscal 20. And they've been phasing in, starting at the highest concentration of poverty, which is 80% and above.
I think
So
we have
that
one
is-
question.
Yep, and that is all of policy area 4.
Rachel, can you talk a little bit about the calculation for the free and reduced meals rate for districts that have stopped collecting forms and just gone to direct certification? And then can you also talk about how undocumented students are calculated in the free and reduced meal formula or addressed?
Sure. Mr. Manko is referring to a program that the federal government has called the Community Eligibility Provision, which allows for schools and entire school systems to no longer collect the free and reduced price meal forms and to instead use something called direct certification, which uses income eligibility programs at the federal level, like SNAP, food stamps, Medicaid, other federal programs that require your income to be verified in order to participate in the program, are part of what's called direct certification. And then what the federal government has done is they created, it's a multiplier. So you get a direct certification rate multiplied by the multiplier. And that is the number of students that the federal government will provide free and subsidized meals for. And so this got a lot of discussion in the commission, and there actually was, as part of the adequacy study, there was a whole separate report on that was done on how the best way to count low-income students and let me just say, low-income students are used, the count of low-income students is used as a proxy for the number of students who are likely to have additional needs and need additional supports to be successful and achieve our performance standards. So it doesn't mean that every student who is low income has needs or is not already performing at the standards, but over time and research, it does bear out that there is a very high correlation between poverty and student performance. So, and particularly concentrations of poverty. So, so getting the count right is important for really for funding formula purposes. The federal government is not so interested in that. They just want to, reduce paperwork and get as free meals and reduce price, but free meals to as many students as they can. And so all over the country, states are grappling with the right way to count students for their funding formulas to determine for this proxy for what we call compensatory education, and we use that same count, free and reduced price meal, for the new concentration of poverty grant. So in these school systems that have entered the CEP program, they're no longer collecting forms, so they don't have an actual count of the number of students that are eligible based on 185%. Which is challenging. One of the commission recommended, and the law requires the Department of Education to create a new form that would be filled out or could be used by school systems. Baltimore City actually piloted a standalone form with, I would say, mixed results. While the commission was doing all this work, and the additional issue or challenge of undocumented students and families became a bigger issue, because the federal government invoked the public benefit provision, which essentially says that if you're an undocumented person in the United States and you receive a public benefit, and actually some documented, it also applies to documented citizens, then you're not eligible for citizenship. And so that created an even a more urgent reason to move away from using free and reduced price meal, because it is a federal public benefit. And so families are less and less willing to fill out the form that attests that that they meet the income requirement, and that so that their children can receive the subsidized school meal. So I would just, so the other thing that the commission recommended is moving to actually expand direct certification to include Medicaid data, which is currently not part of the direct certification in Maryland, but it is other states do use Medicaid data, and it is a very it's a robust data set. There are a lot of when we did a comparison of the direct cert with Medicaid data and free and reduced price meal data from a point of time several years back. It was actually a very close match at the time. So there was hope that that would provide a more robust data set without needing to collect forms. But then with the public benefit issue, Medicaid is a public benefit, CHIP, of course, for the Children's Health Insurance Program. So, you know, it might not prove to be as good of a data source because if families are not willing to sign up for it anymore. So I would honestly say that I think the commission and the blueprint law reflects the best thinking of the time and as far as we could get in the time that we had, but I would say that it's not all figured out yet. And the Department of Education was actually, in fact, they submitted a report a few weeks ago, an interim report looking at neighborhood poverty indicators, which the commission did look at a little bit, as and how and whether those could be used instead of free and reduced price meals or forms or direct certification. So, and I know the new superintendent has done a lot of work in this area in Texas, and hopefully he'll be able to bring his best thinking to the table and help sort it out. So it was a very long answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
I realized that I forgot to toggle back and forth here, so I'll just go back to the implementation plan and just show you, and you have this yourself, how the commission had kind of laid out the phasing or sequencing of the various pieces of policy area 2. And some of these you can see I didn't spend a lot of time talking about. For example, this public relations and communications initiative that actually has been funded since fiscal 20 within the State Department of Education. So that's already been happening to some degree. The career ladder, the phasing of the career ladder with then, so this is sort of the planning period, and then the actual phase in of the career ladder itself. Right now, the statute says that beginning in, so you can see here 2G, require all new educators to opt into the career ladder. So I talked about that it's voluntary up to a certain point, and then it becomes for new teachers mandatory to pursue national board certification. The commission had recommended that that begin in fiscal 26. The legislation, the law actually pushed that date out to 2029. So there are a lot of changes and updates to what the commission's plan had laid out that are a little different in the blueprint law. And this is the training. Move on to college and career readiness. You know, initially, this is fiscal 21 and 22. So initially, the idea was that the college and career readiness standard, the study would be done and the new standard would be set starting in fiscal 23. Of course, we're a couple of years behind that schedule. In 3C, you can see that the transitional supplemental instruction funding, it ramps up, then it stays funded at the higher level, and then it phases down over a 6-year period. That funding has been significantly increased in fiscal 22 to address the COVID-19 impacts and learning losses. And the timeline was extended out another year. see. And then down here in policy area 4, the concentration of poverty weight, the community school coordinators, so the phase in here, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. School-based health centers, I didn't get into that, but there is an expansion of school-based health centers as part of the Blueprint funding. And then here's the direct certification using Medicaid data, and the alternative form that we were just talking about. And then that brings us to policy area 5. Sorry. Clicked on the wrong tab. Okay. So if there are no more questions, I can move on to policy area 5. Okay. So policy area 5 is accountability and governance. And so, as you all are well aware, the law created the AIB. It is an independent unit of state government, so it does not fall under any other department. And it was established to oversee and monitor progress of state and local governments in implementing the blueprint. It was intended to not be permanent. So the statute currently sunsets it at the end of fiscal 2032. We'll get into that a little more in a few minutes. There will be both state and local implementation plans with metrics and the intended outcomes or goals quantified. Part of what the commission talked about and looking at high performing systems around the world, one of the commonalities that they have is they put together what we called expert review teams. So they're teams of professionals that are go around and visit schools to see how they're actually, what they're doing and whether it's working or not. And it's one of the things that the commission felt strongly that Maryland needs to have. And so there are expert review teams that MSDE is charged with managing and administering, and also the CTE committee for CTE programs would also have separate expert review teams that would go out into the schools and look at how they're implementing the blueprint and specific, academic sequencing and curriculums that are being used. It's not a superficial visit. And to look at in top performing systems, they mostly go to the schools that are struggling. One of the changes that was made for Maryland was to make sure that these expert review teams also go to the best schools, so that that schools can learn from each other in terms of what is working in the best performing schools, and even sort of partner low performing with high performing schools to learn from, for the low performing school to learn from the high performing school. So in Maryland, these expert review teams, in the statute, the blueprint requires every school to be visited ultimately by an expert review team. And then this last item, and we'll talk more about this later, but one of the big, I would say, aha moments of the commission was learning that that the that the state's funding of students and schools is regressive, meaning that that less money is spent at the less wealthy, in the less wealthy districts and schools than in the wealthier districts and schools. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but one of it is that the funding, the state provides funding based on formulas that are based on the numbers of students with different needs. And they give it to the school system, but the school systems actually get to decide how those monies are allocated to the school level. And they all have, their approaches to doing that, but it doesn't necessarily flow in the way that the funding is flowing to the school system. And so one of the new requirements under the blueprint is that at least 75% of the funding that is being provided on a per student basis based on enrollments has to actually go to the school that the student is attending. So that is a new requirement. It will, the federal Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, has a version of this. At least the school systems are required to report school level expenditures now, which they have not been required to do before. And to really implement this provision and hold school systems accountable for it is going to require a new financial reporting system at the State Department of Education. And that is part of the commission's recommendations, and the funding provided in the blueprint is so that MSDE can procure a new 21st century financial reporting system where the school systems will actually be able to report this data up to the state in a way that is not hopefully too burdensome. The ESSA calculations are incredibly time consuming, so hopefully this will also help with that. So the major roles and responsibilities of the AIB, of course, we've talked about this a little bit, but one of the biggest and most immediate responsibilities is to develop a comprehensive implementation plan for the blueprint that covers all of the policy areas, all of the entities that are required to implement portions of the blueprint, and that the state agencies and local school systems and other entities would then develop their own plans that are aligned with the comprehensive implementation plan. And once the plan is developed and approved, then the monitoring its implementation and evaluating whether the outcomes that are being achieved are in line with the expectations or the intended outcomes of the blueprint. And we're going to talk more about the comprehensive implementation plan in a few slides. The AIB also has a strong responsibility in terms of the use of the blueprint funds by state agencies and local governments. They're required, AIB, you are required to monitor whether the 75% of funds following students to the school level, what we call the minimum school funding requirement, whether that is being met by the school systems. There is also a whole many pages of statute around the automatic withholding or set aside of a portion of the new blueprint funds for the school systems each year. So 25% sort of gets sort of held in escrow. And the AIB determines whether those funds are released based on the implementation, the development of the implementation plan, and then the actual implementation of the plan. And I think Mark Tucker said at the last meeting that this provision was not designed to be punitive. In fact, the AIB and MSD are really tasked with providing technical assistance, whatever expertise or consulting that school systems and other state agencies need in order to develop a plan that is approvable and then to help them implement it. So the intent is not to be punitive, but the commission and the General Assembly did want to make sure that the AIB had some leverage, I think is the word I'm looking for, you know, to ensure that the LEAs and the other state agencies, and there are some other, you know, local entities involved, you know, are implementing the blueprint as it's intended. And at the end of the day, funding is a good leverage point. And then the AIB also has to develop an appeals process, particularly for LEAs, if they do not agree with the AIB's decisions in terms of their implementation plans or the withholding of funds.
Mr. Manko, did you want to ask your question now, or do you want to, go?
Yeah, hey, Rachel. Just a question on the 75% of dollars that are supposed to flow directly to schools. What requirements are in place to ensure that these dollars help to supplement the allocations that schools are currently getting, and not just supplanting dollars that, you know, are coming from the general per pupil allocation?
So the minimum school funding requirements apply to all the money, not just the new money. So 75% of the state funding coming through the formulas, all the blueprint, all the formulas, which many of them are blueprint, but all of them, 75% of the total has to flow down to the school level.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
And Dr. Lynch has her hand up.
I have a similar question. I'm just wondering, what are the parameters? Have they been set? Will that be our role to set, or will that be MSDE's role to set parameters around how that funding can be spent at the school? You know, I think personally, I would like it to be as open for schools to spend as possible. Sometimes, you know, when we've seen federal funding, the guidelines are so restrictive, it actually makes it difficult for effective spending in the schools. So how will those parameters be developed, and by whom?
That is an excellent question. So first of all, most of the funding in a school goes towards salaries, which is less, tends to be, it's not a fixed cost, but it's gonna, you know, take up a good 75 to 80% of the 75% that has to go down to the school level. So of the other dollars, where they're deciding how to use them, I mean, ultimately, the LEAs are going to be held responsible for implementing their plans and achieving the outcomes. And so the schools will need to sort of then align their spending and policies to achieve what the school system's intended outcomes. So it's going to kind of all work together. It is not all laid out in the statute in terms of how those dollars are to be spent, other than in these sort of the policy areas that we've been talking about. But I think it's going to probably be a combination of the State Department of Education and the AIB, who would ultimately have, provide some guidelines or guidance on how the funds should be spent. But it's not like you referenced federal funds, and the federal funds, yes, can come with many, many strings. And one of the issues with the federal funds is they're restricted funds. So they have, certain purposes that the dollars can be used for. Most of state formula funding, not all, but most of it is unrestricted. So it does not come with those strings. And so when it goes to the school systems and then it goes down to the school level, it will not have strings on this particular funding. Instead of putting strings or restrictions on the funding, the approach that the commission took and the blueprint takes is to put the emphasis on achieving the outcomes or providing certain services, like the college and career, the post-college and career ready pathways, and the pathways, for students who are not college and career ready. Those all have costs involved with them that are built into the formulas, but ultimately the LEAs and the schools are going to be held responsible for implementing the pathways.
Can I ask just a follow-up question? There are some school districts that have a very decentralized way of funding individual schools, and then there's other school systems that are much more centralized. So as we make this shift to really creating systems in which schools are receiving direct funding, is there a system by which the districts will receive support in readjusting their budgets, to your point before, to make sure that this funding isn't in some way supplanting other funding that should also be coming to the schools to support it? This seems like a bigger shift at more centralized school districts, and it seems like they may need additional support in redefining how all that money flows.
That's an excellent point. And some of the school leadership training that MSDE, in, I forget if it's consultation or collaboration with the AIB, is going to be providing. That's why the school principals were specifically incorporated in that training, as well as the sort of central office folks, because part of the vision, for lack of a better word, is ultimately to provide more autonomy at the school level for leadership and decisions to be made at the school level, which, it requires teachers who are, highly qualified and taking on these career ladder leadership roles within the schools, principals who are trained and well prepared to take on, to make these decisions, and, ultimately fewer of these decisions being made at the centralized level and more at the school level. It's one of the interesting things about top performing systems is they, as you heard last meeting, they tend to be more centralized, in terms of like a ministry, and, they don't really, the idea of local control, as in like school systems, doesn't exist so much in many of these top systems, but they also provide much more autonomy at the school level to the professionals in the school building than we do in Maryland and in the US in general.
Rachel,
Yes.
and commissioners, we have a great deal still to cover. And this would not be our last time because we're going to drill down even further as we go through different aspects of our charge and responsibility. So let's be mindful about the time ahead for us, so that at least we can cover and we could come back and more or less pinpoint particular areas that we need, especially some real further analysis on. Okay.
Understood. So in terms of the AIB, and I'm not going to read this all to you, but I tried to sort of provide a lot of the responsibilities that are kind of spread out all over the blueprint law. So overseeing the work of the CTE committee, providing the training for the expert review teams, including the CTE review teams, and actually approving every year MSDE and the CTE committee have to submit sort of the list of schools that they would like to visit in that year and for the AIB's approval. Determining when the career ladder is well established, which is a trigger for some things in the statute. Providing outreach and education on the blueprint to parents, students, and the public. And then also a big part of the AIB's role is to provide to do research and data analysis and provide technical assistance, hire experts and consultants as needed to help you make decisions. And specifically to work with the Maryland Longitudinal Data System Center on looking at Maryland data and particularly around looking at the disaggregated data on student performance of different student subpopulations and the impact of the blueprint on closing achievement gaps. Reviewing the performance of teacher preparation programs, and there's a whole requirement in the law for the Longitudinal Data System Center to provide a report looking at the progress of teacher preparation programs. And sorry, my screen froze here. And some other examples. These are just examples of some of the areas that are kind of specified in the law. Another one is particularly looking at school level diversity of school staff and student bodies, and also the placement of new teachers and effective teachers or highly effective teachers with the types of students that they're placed with. So doing some real research and analysis on that issue. This slide just sort of summarizes the AIB's authority, which is substantial. And I mean, essentially, if there's a conflict between the AIB's decision or a policy that the AIB has set and another state or local entity, the AIB's position controls. And then, as I mentioned, in many places in the statute, agencies have to consult with the AIB before publishing regulations or adopting regulations, and they're required to collaborate or consult with the AIB on many things. And that brings us to specifically the comprehensive implementation plan. It it's intended to sort of, so what the commission developed was a sort of a more less sophisticated version of the implementation plan that I think is envisioned for the comprehensive implementation plan, aside from just the actual policies and their implementation, but sort of drilling down into sort of sub strategies to achieve the policy that the AIB is going to hold the state agency or the school system accountable for, as well as quantifying metrics that will be used to measure progress over time in all of the various policy areas. And we've discussed this before, but the initial plan, comprehensive plan in the statute, the AIB is required to adopt it by February 15th of 2022. Clearly not feasible. And then once an initial plan is adopted, the statute essentially sort of laid out a schedule where if the AIB is going to change the plan, that those changes would be adopted by August each year. Dr. Stapleton?
Yeah, Rachel, I have a question. And on the prior page, you had mentioned that one of the AIB's roles is to approve of anything that other agencies, any regulations from the agencies are not approved. Sorry, consult with.
Yeah.
So MSDE is about to release a comment period on some regulations, supposedly January 3rd. Is that something that we should, as a group, be prepared to then comment on? Or is there a different procedure by which MSDE should consult with us?
So, excellent question. I think the procedure for consultation is not set out in statute. So I think this is one of many areas where a process needs to be developed in terms of what the process should be and what the expectation is. I think in the statute, the intent would be that the consultation would probably occur prior to the publishing of the regulations, but with the timing of the AIB's, creation and appointment and this just drawn out process, I can see there's also, administratively, there are a whole bunch of reports that agencies and school systems have been required to submit to the AIB, which they haven't been able to do up to this point. And I will just say that we're in the process of securing an email address for the AIB, so that can then a whole lot of reports will be submitted to that email address that have been due since back in the summer to the AIB. And so I think it's just it's an excellent question. Which regulations are these that you're talking, January 3rd?
Teacher prep regs.
Yeah. Okay.
The 180 days and then the literacy assessments, that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess put that on a meeting agenda for a very soon meeting to talk about what process, obviously it's too late now because they're publishing them, or they're publishing.
There's a draft that's been out since July, but I think the formal publishing is January 3rd and open for comment.
Okay. Okay. See, where was I? Okay, so there's the comprehensive implementation that the AIB will adopt, and then once that happens, each entity that has to implement a portion of the blueprint has to develop its own implementation plan and submit it to the AIB for approval. So this includes, I gave some examples here, obviously the school systems, and there's another step with the school systems, which is that when they submit their plans, they will be submitting them sort of concurrently to the State Department of Education and the AIB for review. And the State Department of Education then is charged with recommending to the AIB whether to approve or disapprove a school systems plan. And the criteria that the MSDE will use to make that recommendation for approval or disapproval, that criteria is subject to the AIB's approval prior to its use. So in the current statute, MSDE has to submit that criteria to the AIB by April 15th. And then the LEAs and other entities would have to submit their plans to the AIB by June 15th of 2022. And then some other examples of entities that will need to submit plans for specific things. MSDE and the Maryland Higher Education Commission will need to submit a plan for teacher preparation and training. They both have oversight over that. The CTE committee obviously will need to submit their plan. And MSDE will need to submit, either a plan or multiple plans to address a variety of policy issues in the blueprint, including the expert review teams, implementation of the career ladder, implementation of the new professional development system. I didn't list it here, but the college and career ready standard, implementation of the college and career readiness pathways, the curriculum, development of curriculum and instructional materials. There's a whole lot that MSDE is responsible for in the implementation of the blueprint. And then the AIB has to approve the plans. And so the agencies and entities have to keep at it until the AIB approves them. And then once they are approved, obviously the AIB is going to be monitoring the plans, also working with all of the relevant agencies and entities to provide technical assistance and training, to disseminate best practices, to resolve implementation issues, and promote interagency efforts. And also, in addition to just monitoring, being updated periodically by the various entities on their work and their progress. And this is just a little taste of what the school system implementation plans will need to include, and regarding improving student achievement, closing achievement gaps, how they're going to adapt the organization of the school day and instruction and curriculum to help more students achieve college and career readiness, how they're going to identify students who are falling behind, providing that teacher collaborative time that we've talked about, and avoiding the disproportionate placement of students with certain characteristics with new teachers, new inexperienced teachers. The AIB is required to submit an annual report by November 1st each year that incorporates what progress has been made in the past year in implementing the blueprint, the degree to which the state and local agencies are implementing their plans and doing what they're expected to do. Any recommended legislative changes to the blueprint, and whether the funding being provided by the state and the county governments is what was expected and what is necessary to implement the blueprint. So whether it's enough. There is also an independent evaluation that the AIB is required to conduct of the implementation of the blueprint. And it has two parts to it. So the AIB is required to hire an entity who will conduct this independent evaluation, with the first evaluation due October 1st of 2024, and the second and the final evaluation due October 1st of 2030. So 2024 and 2030. And then after the AIB receives the evaluations, the AIB then is required to report to the Governor and General Assembly on the findings of the evaluation and whether the blueprint is being implemented as intended and achieving its outcomes, anticipated outcomes, and whether any changes are needed, corrections, etc. And that would be the 2024 report. The 2030 report has some extra reporting requirements, which is essentially whether the AIB should continue in its role of monitoring implementation of the blueprint after its sunset date of June 30th, 2032. And also whether there should be any changes to the structure, functioning, and authority of state agencies and potentially local school systems. Okay, so that's the end of the AIB portion.
Rachel, I think I see a hand up for Dr. Kerwin.
Rachel, we are going to be required, obviously, to collect a lot of data, and in order to do our work and ensure the accountability. Are our data gathering systems adequate for this task? I mean, will we be able to, do we have systems in place that will get the data we need to do our work?
Another excellent question. I think that in some cases the answer is yes, and in some cases the answer is no. And so that will be something that the AIB will need to talk with, particularly MSDE and local school systems, and then also the LDS Center in terms of what is already collected. I mean, we collect a lot of data in Maryland that isn't necessarily used for anything or published. And so I think one step is to look at what is actually being collected now and how it can be used. And then where there are elements or metrics that absolutely the data is needed, the best way to collect that data. And potentially as part of the student financial reporting system, the new system that MSDE is going to be procuring, there's also elements of that could involve other data that could be collected as part of that new system, depending on what data we're talking about. Are there any other questions?
We have Dr. Doss.
Yes, I just have one question. Beyond the current or the planned funding, does the blueprint specify any funding for MSDE, or is there any other legislation that specifies funding for MSDE to specifically, because it looks like they're going to be revising, updating, and doing a lot as well with the blueprint. And we had mentioned the financial system that they have. So short, in a nutshell, is there any other funding allocated to MSDE for the blueprint?
Yes, there is. Short answer, yes. And so one of the, one of the pieces of information that I shared with you all and is posted these are called, and I'm showing them on the screen now. These are, so the Department of Legislative Services does a fiscal note for every piece of legislation that is introduced and has a bill hearing. And the fiscal note for the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, as you might imagine, was immense. And so there was the fiscal note for the first blueprint bill, and then there was the second blueprint bill. And so what we have done over this past summer, and my colleague Scott Gates, who is on standby in case there are some questions as we get to funding formulas that he could be helpful with. What we did is we spent the summer combining the impacts of the two pieces of legislation. So there's one set of numbers that reflect the state and local impact of the blueprint. So so it's a series of appendices that we had done for Chapter 36 that we've updated to incorporate the 2021 legislation as well. And so within this, if I go to Appendix B, this is the what we call categorical programs. These are state-funded programs that are outside of the funding formulas themselves. So it's kind of a segue to the funding discussion here. This first Appendix A is these are all the funding formulas that make up the blueprint, many of which are existing and some of which are new. And so we consider these the blueprint formulas. And then there are also some pieces of categorical funding that are considered state aid, but most of it is not. And it is on this separate Appendix B here, which shows the funding for various pieces of what we've talked about. But one thing here, the state model curriculum, this is funding for MSDE to implement the college and career ready curriculum standards and instructional materials and all of that. That is funding for MSDE. What here is called the equating study is the college and career ready standard study. And there's also funding for, here is for the expert review teams within MSDE, the CTE committee and skills board. This funding also includes the CTE review committees, the financial reporting here at the bottom. This is the funding for the new financial reporting system. And then in addition to this funding, there is also, or I should say within this, are personnel. And the personnel are also separately, we don't have a chart for that, but there are quite a number of additional personnel that in the fiscal note, DLS estimated that MSDE would need to be able to implement the blueprint. And you can, There's a lot of information in these appendices. I just wanted you to have them. And certainly if you have any questions, Scott can answer them. But like Appendix C is showing by school system the increase in state aid under the blueprint formulas. And then we have estimated per pupil, state aid per pupil. And then D2 is the increase under the blueprint. So D1 is the total, D2 is the increase. And then Appendix E and F deal with local funding. And we're going to get into this in a minute, but Appendix E is showing where the state in the blueprint is relieving certain jurisdictions, and in this case, we mean the counties, not the school systems, of some of the new funding requirement under the blueprint. And then Appendix F is showing what the projected increase in local funding is required under the blueprint in each year is shown here in Appendix F. And then the Appendix G has per pupil estimates for local funding. And then Appendix H sort of puts it all together with the state and local funding by LEA. And again, these are all projections based on our estimates and assumptions at the time. So I think that brings us, if there aren't any other questions, let me get back to the right place here, to the new and revised funding formulas. There's a lot of information here, and I wanted to provide it to you so that you had it in terms of what the formulas are and how they work. But I'm sort of just going to focus on, again, sort of the 10,000 foot view here, and then happy to answer questions now or later. But as Mark Tucker said at the last meeting, the commission's approach to the determining how much funding to provide is different than the traditional approach that have been used by states, including Maryland, to determine how much funding is needed for K-12 schools. And you heard a little bit about the Thornton Commission, which was the predecessor to the Kerwin Commission, which in 2002 recommended a new set of state funding formulas based off of this idea of adequacy, which is looking at how much, estimating how much is needed for students to achieve the state's performance standard. And as I mentioned, Maryland did hire APA to conduct another adequacy study that began in 2014, and that was part of the Thornton law required another adequacy to be done in the future. And so that sort of formed the basis of the commission's work around looking at funding and funding formulas. But it was not the end of the work, because as the commission moved towards recommending specific policies that should be implemented, which was very different than what the Thornton Commission did, which really just looked at the funding formulas themselves and how much was adequate without actually identifying the policies or the ways that the funds should be spent, or that we know based on looking at top performing systems works, is effective. And so that's a very big difference in approaching school finance from what do we need to do to improve our schools, and then how much is it going to cost? That's basically what the Kerwin Commission did. And so the how much is it going to cost piece of the puzzle was done by costing out and estimating the different impacts of the policies that the commission was proposing. So first they came up with the policies in policy areas 1 to 5, and then the last step and then figured out how much it would cost to implement those policies. And then the very last step was figuring out how to incorporate that funding into formulas and how to distribute it to the school systems in an equitable way, and how much the state should provide versus the county should provide, because we have a shared, our school finance system is based for the most part on the state and the locals sharing in the cost of education 50-50.
And also it'd be how long you would do this as well, because when you selected the 30-32, then that will also impact the amount that you're going to spend, because you could have had a shorter period of time, even a longer period of time. So big discussions, I recall, was how long do you carry this, and for what extent?
And how long to take to ramp up to the full implementation. Exactly. And actually the next, this next slide is actually showing, and this is going out through 2030. This was 2034, wouldn't all fit on this one slide, but this is showing the phase up of the blueprint funding. The blue and so the bar is state funding, and the blue is the formula funding that is going out to the school systems. And then the amounts in orange are those categorical programs, the other funding that is needed to implement the blueprint. And so you can see by fiscal 30, it's about 3.1 billion, B with the billion dollars of state funding that is being provided above and beyond what would have been provided before the blueprint. And the line is the amount of local funds that DLS has estimated will be required for the counties to appropriate to their school systems. So you can see it's a pretty big delta. Let me just go back and see if there was. Yeah, I think the other thing I wanted to say from this slide is just, so the new formulas that I'm about to talk about take effect for the upcoming fiscal year. So fiscal 23 will be the first year that the new funding formulas will be funded in the budget completely. And so there has been funding provided since fiscal 20 for specific programs as part of that Bridge to Kerwin legislation I talked about. And then there's also funding in 22 to, in fact, I think I have a slide on this next, not next, to hold the school systems harmless for enrollment losses during the pandemic, and also to address learning losses. So this next slide here is sort of just a snapshot of what our funding formulas and our whole school finance system looks like prior to the blueprint. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that one because we're going to talk about the blueprint. And so what this slide is showing in italics are all of the new formulas. And for the foundation program and these per pupil weights, comp ed, English learners, and special education, funding for these programs has been, per pupil funding for these programs has been increased under the blueprint. So the formulas aren't new, but the per pupil amount being provided through the formulas is increased from what it was prior to the blueprint. And so a really fundamental piece of the school finance system in Maryland and most states is wealth equalizing the aid, so that counties that have higher wealth receive less state funding and have to put in more of their own local funding. And conversely, the counties that have less wealth receive more state aid, and the counties put in less in those jurisdictions. But the whole system is designed so that overall, on average, 50% of the costs are being funded by the state and 50% are being funded by the county governments. And wealth is a calculation that, to just sort of keep it simple, is a combination of the property wealth, or the assessable base in each county, and the income wealth, or the net taxable income in each county. And one of the things that you may possibly have heard some discussion about is this use of September or November net taxable income, or NTI, data. And it's been a debate in the state for many years. And we slowly, for a while, pre-blueprint, we funded sort of, everybody got more. Whichever way you did better, you got more money. And now the formulas are using November net taxable income. And the November data is the later data. It's the more inclusive data set. And so that was one of the changes in the blueprint. And there's also something called tax increment financing, which is an economic development tool that some jurisdictions use. And prior to the blueprint, there was a provision of law that excludes a portion of tax increment financing from a county's property wealth. And that is now been incorporated into the funding formula for property wealth, as opposed to separately. But ultimately, every county has a wealth calculation. They have a wealth, local wealth. But the real issue is the relative wealth, is sort of the positioning of the counties against each other in terms of their relative wealth. And even more than just their relative total wealth, it's their relative wealth per pupil. So enrollment also plays a pretty big role in wealth equalization. And that is what determines the distribution of the state funding to the school systems under the various formulas. And so the biggest education program that the state has is the foundation program, by far and away the largest program. And it is intended to, it's called the foundation program because it's intended to provide, the foundation of funding for public schools. It's also referred to as the base amount sometimes. And so the foundation program is a per pupil amount that is based on, in the past, this calculation of adequacy. And now it's the combination of adequacy and implementing the blueprint, the cost of implementing the blueprint. And so, oops. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So the foundation program is an existing program. The Thornton law changed it from what it changed it and made it an adequacy-based formula. And one of the changes that the blueprint makes is it permanently bases foundation funding on the greater of the fall enrollment count or a 3-year rolling average. And this is something that our APA consultant recommended that the state move towards. And it essentially what it does is it helps counties, school systems that have declining enrollment. It kind of gives them a ramp to reduce the funding over time rather than all at once. So then within this general education aid category, blueprint funding. So part of what the commission did is sort of determine where funding for different blueprint policies should fit into the formulas. And so a good amount of it goes into the foundation program, which is a sort of a general purpose funding source, completely unrestricted funding. And so this is where funding was added to the per pupil foundation amount for all students to become college and career ready. So there's a certain amount per student that's provided for this. The 10% teacher salary increase that we talked about earlier. There's also funding for career counseling, which we haven't even talked about. School maintenance and operations, behavioral health, the principal career ladder, the teacher career ladder is a separate formula. And then technology was added this past session, an increase in the technology, the amount of funding being provided for technology was increased. And so the foundation amount is going to increase up to $12,648 for each student by fiscal 34. And then we have 2 new formulas that fall under this general category, which is career ladder funding and the new full day pre-K funding formula. And these, like the foundation program, these programs are wealth equalized, and funding is provided based on, for the career ladder, the number of teachers who are national board certified, and that will begin this upcoming fiscal 23 will include funding for teachers who are national board certified now. And if they're teaching in a low performing school, they will get the additional $7,000 as well. And then the other pieces of the career ladder funding will not be funded until the career ladder is actually developed and established. So that other funding won't come about until fiscal 25, most likely. And then we have this new funding formula for full day pre-K that we talked about a little earlier. It is based on the cost of quality for pre-K education programs, which, as you can see, is higher per student than the cost for K to 12 students. So at full implementation, almost $20,000 per student for pre-K student, for full day pre-K students will be funded through a combination of state, local, and family share. Very, very briefly, the commission recommended shifting from what we currently have, because it still exists, the Geographic Cost of Education Index, to a different index called the Comparable Wage Index. All of this is, both of these indices, I mean, the goal is to identify counties where costs are higher and help provide more funding to those jurisdictions. The big change here is that the GCEI is not, it's not wealth equalized. The state pays for the whole thing. So that will change beginning in fiscal 24. So that change does not occur in the upcoming fiscal year. It's a year later. Guaranteed tax base is a program that was created by the Thornton Commission and the Thornton Law. And the Kerwin Commission looked at what we call the GTB formula and ultimately did not recommend any changes to that program. So that will continue. So that was the general education category. Another category that we kind of use is what we call targeted education aid. And these are the funding formulas that are based on the enrollment of student populations, subsets of students. And so this probably will sound very familiar to you, but there's a formula for special education students. There's a formula for what we call compensatory education, which is that proxy that we use free and reduced price meal counts for. And then there is the English learners formula, which is based on identified students who have been identified as not proficient in English. And all of those formulas existed or were created or modified by Thornton, and they essentially were unchanged by the blueprint and the commission, other than the per pupil amount was increased to address implementing blueprint policies and to address adequacy, the adequacy estimates. And so I'm not going to talk about the floors right now. Okay, and then there are some new targeted aid programs as part of the blueprint that we've talked about on the policy side. On the funding side, for transition, I'm going to come back to concentration of poverty. For transitional supplemental instruction, this is a per student amount that is multiplied by the number of third graders who are not reading at proficient level or on the English language arts grade 3 assessment. And that funding is provided to the school systems for them to then distribute. There's also a new funding formula that provides the funds for the post-college and career-ready pathways. So the foundation program has the money for bringing all students up to college and career-ready. But then for students for the post-college and career-ready pathways, it is a separate formula that is based on the number of students in each LEA that have met the CCR standard by the end of 10th grade. So it's sort of a, at least in Maryland, we really have not had formulas that were driven by inputs other than student enrollment counts. So this is starting to look at basing, for college and career readiness, it's basing the funding on if you've achieved the outcome of you've got students and more students achieving college and career readiness, then you will get the funding that helps you to provide the college and career ready pathway, post college and career ready pathways that we want to have for students, we require for students. And then we've talked about these concentration of poverty school grants. There's like two parts to it. What we call the personnel grant, which is the funding for the community school coordinator and the full-time healthcare coverage. And that is 100% state funded. And then there is a per pupil amount that is driven by the school enrollment number, which is provided to cover the wraparound services. And on this next slide, so I mentioned that this concentration of poverty grant is one of the things that has been implemented already. And so beginning in fiscal 20, the personnel positions have been funded for the schools at or above 80% concentration of poverty. And then you can see fiscal 21, it bumped down to the 75%, fiscal 22 to 70%. And so for the upcoming budget year, it will drop down another 5 percentage points to 65%. And then the per pupil funding is essentially coming in 2 years behind that. So the current budget year, there is funding in the budget, and the 80% and above schools are receiving per pupil funding for wraparound services for the first time. And that will continue to phase in until all of the schools are receiving per pupil funds by fiscal 27. There's also a phase in of the amount of per pupil funding being provided. And that phase up is shown here on this chart. You can see it gets to the full 100% of the formula amount in fiscal 30. There's also mostly outside of the blueprint, but some programs that fall within the blueprint that are not wealth equalized and are provided through other programs like the Judy centers. That's not wealth equalized, but it's based on the number of centers in each school system and things like that. And then we just wanted to kind of give you the full picture. So there's also student transportation funds that the school systems receive, both for regular transportation and for special transportation. And of course, there's teachers' retirement funding that the state and the local jurisdictions provide. And that was not changed by the blueprint. So Scott, I'm actually going to ask you to talk about maintenance of effort if you don't mind. They're probably tired of hearing me talk and my throat is getting pretty sore.
Okay, fair enough. So we have two layers of maintenance of effort. We have a provision that deals with per pupil funding and basically requires that that you fund the same amount per pupil as you did in the prior year. And under pre-blueprint law, there is also this provision that would require an additional amount per pupil for those who have an average that's below the running average for the state. But the second portion of effort requirement is the local share of the foundation program. So that is what existed pre-blueprint, is you compare your per pupil maintenance of effort requirement to your local share of the foundation. So for many years running, and what would be predicted into the future, it's always this per pupil requirement that well exceeds that other step of looking at the foundation program. But when we move into the blueprint law, let me see what this, okay. When we move into the blueprint law, we do have some jurisdictions where the combined local share of many programs, which we now look at, so we're looking at the local share of the foundation program, but several others, including the CWI and several others that Rachel has already discussed. So that is now what you compare to your per pupil requirement. And as I said, for some jurisdictions, that combined local share is going to be higher than the maintenance of effort on a per pupil basis used to be. And the second bullet on this slide is telling you that under the blueprint, that provision whereby the per pupil maintenance of effort might be increased based on your jurisdiction's statewide average, that goes away after fiscal 23. So there's no longer this ratcheting up effect under the per pupil provision of maintenance of effort.
Go ahead, keep going.
Okay. Because the local share requirements increase what a jurisdiction would have to do under the blueprint law, and to varying degrees, we have effort adjustments to provide relief with respect to the new law. One of those is our education effort index, and that is a provision whereby we look at the combined local share, as I just discussed, of these several programs and compare that to your jurisdiction's wealth, and then from each county's result in doing so, we take a statewide average, express that as 1.0, so it's indexed. So we call it the index, and then those above 1.0 or over the statewide average receive relief. And this slide is also telling you that relief varies depending on the degree to which your effort as calculated under this index exceeds that 1.0 level. So those with higher effort receive more funding and they receive it sooner. I think that covers that page.
Yeah.
Then we also have additional relief provisions under the blueprint. This includes we talked about the guaranteed tax base earlier. This includes relief to those jurisdictions that receive that grant. However, the first 10 million in value under the GTB, the city is not relieved of. Then floors, so we skipped over the discussion of the floors. So basically, Rachel talked about the state and local shares of funding being 50-50 overall, but we have the higher wealth jurisdictions receiving a lower percentage of that. So, and because some of those, in fact, if you look at Worcester, their statewide wealth per pupil is actually twice the statewide average. So if you run the foundation formula, for example, you'd have them funding 100% of it. But so the floors provisions say that there's a percentage minimum that's guaranteed from the state. And so what this relief provision does is say that full program amount that we start with that should be split between state and local doesn't need to be overfunded. So the relief is based on the degree to which the combined state and local would exceed that initial per student amount. I know that's a lot, but that, and then the CWI relief is relief with respect to what will be the new measure in terms of recognizing local costs that are above average in certain jurisdictions. So that would start under fiscal 24. So those combined are the 4 relief provisions with respect to the new law, in addition to the pre-existing GTB, which provides relief.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. So basically, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, sure.
Dr. Curran, do you have a question on that?
Just a point I thought you were going to make, you had a bullet on it, but you wanted to move ahead. That is that under the old formula, local jurisdictions weren't required to put in their share
Right.
of some of the special needs costs. And the commission and the blueprint requires now. Could you just say a word about that? Because I want people to appreciate this change.
Sure. Yeah, this was a very big, I would call this another one of the aha moments for the commission, where I talked earlier about the learning that Maryland's overall school finance system was regressive, was actually quite a shock, including to me, because under Thornton, which I worked on, we specifically designed it to be progressive, so that students with more needs received more funding, and they received what we had determined was adequate funding. But what we learned is that while the state was providing its funding through the formulas in a progressive manner, because the way that our maintenance of effort law was designed, which was basically, you've got to keep doing at least what you provided the prior year on a per student basis, maintenance of effort. That was not tied to adequacy or to the funding formula, what the actual calculated local share of the formulas was. The school systems were not, depending on the county, were not receiving enough to fully fund the needs of their students. And so that was one of the major recommendations of the commission was, in addition to the local share of the foundation, that the counties also had to fund the local share of every funding formula, every wealth equalized funding formula. And so that is a big change. And for some counties, it is a very substantial increase in local funding that they are going to need to provide under the blueprint. But in some cases, this is because for many years, the previous maintenance of effort calculation wasn't really what they needed to be providing to the schools. It wasn't, they were following the law, but the law wasn't requiring them to put in as much as they needed to be putting in. And so.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I thought I had another something about that, but I don't think I do. So, oh, I know what I wanted to say, but there is still concern, despite the effort adjustment that Scott talked about, and the I think it's almost $500 million that the state will be providing in new aid to relieve the locals of some of their local funding requirement. There are still jurisdictions that are very concerned about the amount of funding that they're going to need to provide to their school systems in the future. And in the 2021 legislation, the Department of Legislative Services is required to do a study of the impact, the fiscal impact on the counties of funding their share of the blueprint. And we have been working on that, and the report will be out in January. So the counties are looking forward to seeing that report. So real quickly, I sort of talked about this already, but part of the 2021 legislation also addressed the impact of COVID-19, both on the funding formulas, because this new 3-year rolling average that we're using as part of the enrollment count, the fall 2020 enrollment counts were significantly lower than the fall of 2019. And And that had implications for the funding formulas and for the local maintenance of effort funding requirements for fiscal 22. We must have lost the chair and now he is back. There was a significant impact on the funding formulas and how much state aid the LEAs would receive because of these lower fall 20 enrollment counts. And so in the budget, the governor provided funding to hold the school systems harmless from the decreases in state aid. And then there's also additional state aid and a number of reporting requirements that the school systems need to report, including to the AIB, which goes back to some of the email address and the reports being submitted to you all. But there is federal COVID-19 relief funding, federal coronavirus relief funds that the state received that the governor budgeted for the school system, so that when they're required to provide summer school, they had to provide summer school this past summer, and they have to provide summer school, a significantly expanded summer school programming for the summer of 2022. There's also an additional $150 million to help students who fell behind with tutoring. And then there's also $25 million for to help students and address student mental health and trauma needs. And I'm just going to finish really quick and then we'll take questions. I just thought you all would like just a very big high level view of how the blueprint is being paid for. So the General Assembly has identified a number of revenue sources that are going into a special fund, which is called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund, that is available to cover the increased costs associated with the blueprint. And this includes online sales tax revenues from online purchases, over $100 million. The first $100 million stays in the general fund, and the rest, certain online sales, goes into the special fund. There's also a new digital downloads tax, as well as a digital advertising tax, which has not actually been implemented yet. But the digital downloads tax did take effect in March of 2021. And then there is, we've talked a little about this, the sports betting revenues, both the license fees and then the state's share of the betting revenues. And that begins this current fiscal year, in fact, this current month. And then there are some other one-time revenue sources. This last slide just gives you sort of a picture of the availability of blueprint fund revenues to cover the costs of the blueprint. And these are the projected costs of the blueprint in the fiscal note. And as you can see, there is enough between what is already in the fund and what is projected to come into the fund, enough funding available to cover, fully cover the costs through fiscal 26 and into fiscal 27. And if digital advertising revenues do become available beginning in fiscal 26, then it's also covered through fiscal 27. And that's just how the numbers look right now. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and I see some hands up.
Well, we're going to go ahead and take the hands. Who's up? Yeah.
I had Dr. Kerwin, unless he didn't put his hand down, and then Dr. Lynch.
Yeah.
I think Britt said he asked his question already.
Question was answered. Thank you.
I am just wondering about the drops in COVID enrollment. You talked a little bit about holding harmless in FY22 and the having to fund at the higher formula in holding harmless in FY20. Now that we're coming past that and some school districts still haven't recovered their enrollment, sort of what is the plan moving forward? Is there like an incremental plan? Is there a cutoff by which current enrollment will now be used? What is the movement on that?
So right now, the law excludes the fall 2020 enrollment from the 3-year averages and from the maintenance of effort calculation, but it did not address fall of 2021 enrollment. So that would be something that the General Assembly would need to consider modifying the law. The governor will include funding in the fiscal 23 budget when he submits it in January. He does have discretion, as he did last year, to provide hold harmless grants if those are necessary for school systems if their enrollment declines, are causing them to actually lose state aid year over year. That is what the hold harmless grant did last year. But the governor does have discretion to provide funds in the budget beyond what the formulas require. And so that would be sort of the next step, is to see what is in the budget and what the actual enrollment numbers are too.
And I have Dr. Maradas.
Thank you. Is there any text that addresses like targeted educational aid that's related to a local jurisdiction's student demographics? I guess, for example, there's a section where it stated targeted education aid and the number of 11th graders who have met the CCR standard. Was there any discussion or anything about student demographics within a local jurisdiction impacting that?
There are some constitutional issues around using student race or ethnicity as identifiers for funding, if that is what you're asking. If you're asking something else.
Okay, no, you're addressing it. You're
Okay,
answering it.
so it was discussed in the commission. It did come up, and there are constitutional issues around that. And so using sort of the number of students who are proficient or not proficient, the number of, concentrated poverty schools are kind of proxies or ways to address, I think, what you're referring to in legal ways.
Okay, no, you got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
And it looks like Mr. Mako.
Hey, Rachel. I know when the section when you were talking about the comprehensive implementation plan and this kind of looming deadline of February 15th, and you made the comment that you felt like this is probably going to be a very, very difficult mark to make. What is the plan moving forward, since we're kind of at a delayed start and the timelines are very compressed? And maybe that's a larger conversation for the group, but I guess just cautious around the expectations for meeting deadlines, but also trying to make decisions that are judicious and well informed and not hastily decided upon. So I guess just some feedback or recommendations around that, and what is a realistic timeline, how to proceed moving forward.
Well, I can certainly start, and then I'm sure the chair has probably something to add about this, but I think at your first meeting, we talked about sort of the most immediate sort of to-do things on your to-do list, and the timing of the comprehensive implementation plan was, I think, one of the number one top of the list items. And there was some discussion at that meeting about as a group discussing, what is a realistic schedule, and then providing through the annual report that for 2021, November 1st, the AIB was not even appointed at that point for you to submit that report, but to potentially provide perhaps a letter to the governor and the presiding officers once they're back in session in January with an update, and then a suggested what you all think is a realistic timeline to propose to them, and then they could either respond to the letter or adjust the deadlines in a bill.
Well, part of it also is that we need to talk to some of our partners. And we have an opportunity to do so as well. So we're looking to come up with a series of different dates, but there's an impact for others as well. So we need to make certain that we're all coordinated appropriately there. But it is a real concern, but I'm not sure that we could do anything other than to have them understand the challenges that we are facing with the lateness of the board starting, and then adjusting the dates for the appropriate time they're in. And to also make certain that this is basically a transitional year, that the expectations cannot be met, but that we fully intend to get back on schedule as soon as we're up and fully running. Did that answer your question, Joe?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's all I see
Well-
for hands.
Okay, you have anything else to add from that? If not, I want to thank you for a very thorough presentation. It was really quite thorough. There may be additional questions that we'll have to dwell on a little bit later on, and hopefully we'll be able to do that as we go through it, because there's an awful lot for us to unpack here. There are a couple of other things that we have in terms of our upcoming meetings. And the next meeting date, Rachel, is when?
It is January 5th at 1:30, and that meeting is going to be essentially entirely in closed session.
Got you. And there's an opportunity for us to socialize on January the 8th, 3 to 5, casual, nothing more than just getting together, and so that we can put a face with the name and the body as quickly as we can. Let me again thank you, Rachel, for your work and for all that you've done today. It's quite a bit, and I understand your voice going out, but we're grateful for all your work and your contributions that you've made. Is there anything else that you'd like to cover? Oh, one other thing. I've asked a couple of, and I've assigned a couple of people to a number of things that we need to get started on. For example, as you may know, I asked that Britt and Fagan to help on the recruitment process. I asked Joe to look at what a recommendation may look like in terms of establishing advisory board. And he has a recommendation, and if there are some others, we will consider those as well. But at one point of our next meeting or so, we may want to listen to ideas and suggestions, because I think we need to move on that a little bit sooner than later. So that maybe you should send that around if you've not done so already, Joe, to make sure that people at least see that if they have any ideas and suggestions to that recommendation, that we can incorporate that in our next meeting or so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Joe?
Yeah, I can definitely do that.
Okay. All right, there any other questions? Okay, then thank you so very much. We'll see you at the next meeting.
Okay.